Hi there, welcome along to Taking the Biz, the channel dedicated to A-level business students and their revision. First time watchers, think about subscribing. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at a theory known as Hofstede's 6 dimensions of international cultures. So here's the background. Hofstede was an academic who spent several years conducting studies in the technology company IBM, where he was given access to more than 100,000 of their employees who were based in the company in different countries all over the world. And what Hofstede developed was a theory that touched on organisational culture and perhaps allows us to understand that an organisation may have a very successful organisational culture, one that works very well, one that is very beneficial to that organisation. But when it comes to transplanting that culture on satellites of the business or new branches that may have been opened in different cultures, because different nations value different things, because their people hold different beliefs, it may be that what the culture that's worked in one nation may be less effective in another nation. So Hofstede broke down into 6 different areas where he thought peoples from different cultures and different nations had different values and belief systems, starting with what he called his individualism versus collectivism dimension. And so what Hofstede discovered was that people from different nations had different views in terms of the type of person that was highly valued in that society. So in some nations, they truly value the star player, the person that gets results, the person that performs the best. Whereas in other nations, they put greater emphasis and hold more value on the team player. Not necessarily the person that always wins, not necessarily the person that always gets the best results, but the person that perhaps acts the most selflessly, is the most collaborative, that puts the team at the heart of everything that they do. And so Hofstede ranked these different nations. He scored them on an index according to those that very much valued individualism and those nations that valued collectivism. His second way of classifying different nations and differing between their values and their beliefs was what he called the power distance dimension. And that relates to how much the people from a nation value traits like seniority, like status, their position or their rank in society, versus how much they value their ability to get things done, the results that they've achieved, the expertise that they may have accrued. And so some nations would place great value on seniority. People who are at the top of the organisation are the people that should be making the decisions and setting the strategic direction. That comes from your rank, your status, maybe even your age or your length of service. But in other nations, they don't consider things like length of service as important as just being able to get the job done, as being able to achieve results, as to having some kind of expertise to offer. And so in a business sense, this relates to how accepting a culture might be of more junior employees in the organisation contributing to decision making and contributing to strategy. In some nations, it might be almost frowned upon because those people don't have seniority, whereas in other nations, it might be actively encouraged. Third aspect that Hofstede identified, he referred to as short-termism versus long-termism. Quite self-explanatory. This relates to how much a culture, how much a nation values long-term planning and what they even consider to be the long term. In some nations, they're appreciative, they value knowing where an organisation is going, not just over the next few years, but over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And they really place great emphasis on looking far ahead and looking at the longer term. Whereas other nations, and the UK would be an example of this, they have more short-termist views. They might see the long term as kind of the next 3 years, 4 years, and really they are more used to working with short-term goals in mind. Employees from that nation are more used to dealing with short-termist pursuits, dealing with events over the next 12 to 24 months, rather than always casting a gaze to several years into the future. And Hofstede was just saying that we can rank nations, we can put them on an index, and that some nations will come out very highly and really value a long-termist approach, whereas other nations would value a shorter-termist approach. Hofstede's fourth dimension he referred to as masculinity versus femininity. And this relates to the kind of character traits that might be highly valued by those nations, by those cultures. So in some nations, they value masculine traits quite highly. Traits like being competitive, being tenacious, winning, and they value material rewards that we might give to people for getting those results, for achieving those gains. Whereas other nations score more highly on feminine traits. Traits like consultation, on team working, on building relationships, even on aspects of work like placing an importance on a work-life balance. These are traits that are more highly valued by feminist nations that score more lowly when it comes to masculinity. Hofstede's fifth cultural dimension, uncertainty avoidance, really refers to how much emphasis a nation places on being able to deal with new situations, with unforeseen circumstances, with dealing with the unknown. It's about how much anxiety a nation of people might experience when being confronted with new and uncertain situations. So in some nations, the people from that culture, the people from that country might be quite anxious when in a business context they're having to deal with uncertainty, with new situations, with events that they've not experienced before. And that'll be something that the people from those nations find quite difficult to confront, and employees from those nations might really value more policies, more rules that kind of govern how they're going to respond to different situations. Whereas some nations might be a little bit more flexible. They're more comfortable working in the unknown. They're more comfortable dealing with dynamic environments where there's more uncertainty, where the future is a little bit less certain to predict. And so Hofstede said nations would have different approaches, different anxiety levels when faced with new situations. What Hofstede added towards the end of his studies was a sixth dimension known as the indulgence versus restraint dimension, which really refers to how a nation views people pursuing their own personal needs, gratifying their own personal needs. So in some nations, they're quite tolerant, they're quite accepting of the fact that people have their own goals, they have their own needs, and that they are entitled to act in a way that furthers their own self-interest. Whereas in other nations, that might be less warmly thought of, and maybe there's perhaps more of an expectation that people exercise restraint in the pursuit of their own goals, will acknowledge the needs of others before the needs of themselves, and will act in a way that perhaps promotes the greater good rather than the self-interest of the individual. So there's a real difference between how different nations might actually view those two different pursuits. Some are very comfortable with people acting in their own self-interest. Some nations, some cultures, that would be quite alien to them, and they would expect people to exercise restraint when pursuing their own personal goals. So there's Hofstede's 6 dimensions of international cultures, really a theory that allows us to understand that people from different regions, people from different cultures, different nations, have different views, different standpoints, different beliefs, different values, and that has to be taken into account when firms are dealing with employees in those nations. There's Hofstede's International Cultures. Hopefully that one will help you do a revision. We'll see you very soon, but in the meantime, keep on taking the biz.